Hi, welcome to another edition of What I Learned This Week. So, another week gone, and I'm here to talk about what I learned this week. So this week, I was going through, just scrolling through videos on YouTube, and I don't know if you know this, but YouTube has loads of free movies at the moment, and Margin Call is one of them. So, um, it's one of my favorite movies. I've watched it many times, and but this last week, something that I I I just basically been watching it more for the entertainment value than the actual, than the lesson behind it. Or not, I won't say the lesson, more like trying to understand the financial concepts. I don't, I'm not going to pretend that I know, well, I'm a financial expert or anything like that. Um, Obviously, I work in finance, but you know, I'm not an expert when it comes to that sort of level um, of um, of trading, and things like that. Anyway, so one of the things that jumped at me this last week was the concept of um, something called VAR. For those of you who are football fans, I'm sure you're thinking, what VAR? What's VAR got to do with finance? Um, and for those of you who don't know football, VAR is basically a system of assisting the referee with decisions or on-field events that they may have missed. Now, VAR in this context in the movie is basically a financial model, and if you know a thing or two about um, working in finance, like literally, there are models for forecasting. There are all kinds of models. Models are basically what a lot of aspects of finance is based on, right? So, quite typically and understandably, there is this model called VAR, which stands for Value at Risk um, model. So basically, it was a risk model. Um, this model was what um, a lot of financial institutions relied on prior to the Great Recession of 2008, 2008. So basically, the thing that jumped at me when I was going through this movie again was, and I had to stop and basically go through it. I'd glossed over it. I mean, I knew that you know the character played by Stanley Tucci, um, Eric Dale. I knew that he had actually stumbled on something that was not captured by the model that they were using for forecasting risk. So I knew that there was something about along those lines, but I didn't really like catch on, the meaning. So I basically did a little bit of research and I dug in a little bit more. And so value at risk basically is a model that basically measures the risk of a hedge fund, a fund, whatever it is, an organization losing their money, their own funds, right? So it would say something like, let's just say a hedge fund A has $200 million of his own funds. It would say something like, there is a 99% chance that hedge fund A will not lose $200 million. Now, obviously, and what that implies is that there is a 1% chance that it will lose the the $200 million. Now, this model also looked at basically the parameters, or basically what yeah, just what the parameters that this model used was something along the lines of, um, you know, historical data where the market never really does dips more than 15%, you know. So essentially, this model assumed that the market will never, you know, go below 15%, um, you know, and so that's and this is my own interpretation of and based on my research and everything. So for those of you who will be watching this and who are basically much better, you might find that it's a bit of a take, but this is my understanding of it. So the model basically did two things. It basically looked at historical data and says, well, we don't think the market's ever gonna do so bad that it will drop 20%. It will always be 10, 15% on a bad day, and things like that. Now, the setting of margin call was around the Great Recession, of 2008 as well. So now I'm not going to delve too much what into some of the other technicalities, but essentially, one of the things that caused the Great Recession um, from the financial institutions' point of view was that a lot of institutions, like Lehman Brothers, for example, had these, security, had these mortgage securities. So basically, bets on on mortgages. They had these bets on mortgage doing well or doing bad, essentially. Um, they put these bets on mortgage, and they took loans to make those bets on the mortgages. So some of these mortgages were, subprime. Um, Again, I'm not gonna. They're not high quality mortgages. I don't want to delve too much into it, but quite typically, what that meant was that it tracks the housing sector. So obviously, as the housing sector in America was dipping with all the um, you know foreclosures increasing at a rapid rate, those mortgages began to underperform. So um, a lot of institutions were caught holding the bag essentially, and that's why a lot of them went under. The biggest one being Lehman Brothers. Okay, so back to what I was saying. So what value at risk basically measures that, and in the movie, Eric Dill, the character Eric Dill, who was acted by Stanley Tucci, was basically had basically used parameters outside of the model. So it said, for example, for example, it said something along the lines of, okay, what if there was a 50% correction and things like that? What would happen, right? So those were the parameters he used, not the 15% that the model was using. Um, and long and short, he found out that they were in trouble. So this model was essentially telling the firm in the movie, margin call, that they were okay. They were doing fine. There was no problem at all whatsoever. Um, Whereas, because he now expanded the parameters and looked outside of what the value at risk was using, he now discovered that they were in trouble. The way I will explain value at risk is, say for example, you know you commute to work, right? Work starts at 9 o'clock. You know you've been working at the same place for like 6, 7, 8 years now. You know that whatever happens, it takes you about 10, at most 15 minutes to get to work, right? So that let's use that understanding as the value at risk model. So you know that it takes you 15 minutes to get to work on a bad day. So you're good. And then recently, you now realize that on your way to work, there was this huge housing project going on. Um, that was basically going to that basically contained when complete would contain about 5,000 um, apartments, different sizes of apartments, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, and 4 bedroom apartments being built by this huge developer along the way to work. And as it was being completed, people started moving in. Um, at first, it was just a little bit that was complete. So just about 20 families moved in, especially into the bigger apartments, right? But then they sped up the development and 3 quarters of it got finished. And about half of the estate, of this housing estate, was basically families moved in within a 2 week period. Half of the expected number of people moved in within, so 2,000 houses, apartments were now occupied. Now, when all this happened within a 2 to 3 week period, now let's say for example, while all of this was happening, you were on holiday, right? While all of this happened, you're on holiday. You're now back from the holiday, and then you're now back to work. You obviously have to go back into work, and using the model of whatever happens, 15 minutes is the time that it takes me to get to work, will fail, right? It will fail. It will fail because, first of all, the fact that there are families that have moved, a huge number of families that have now moved in, means that A, around the time you commute to work will be the same time there'll be school runs. Um, they'll also be commuting to work. So all of a sudden, commuting to work, the time it takes to commute to work more than doubles from 15 minutes to 30 minutes, but you don't know. So you take 15 minutes as usual. You're like, you know what, let me just be on the good side and take 20 minutes. Let me leave home 20 minutes early. And what happens? You're caught up in traffic and you don't make it to work on time. That's exactly what a lot of firms did, in the run up to the 2008 um, recession. They were using this model. Obviously, there were loads of other things. So firms had this model, and on one hand, but they kept taking on leverage. In other words, loans. They kept taking on loans upon loans upon loans upon loans. At some point, um, the ratio of loans to actual funds owned by a lot of these financial institutions was something like 30 to 1, and things like that. So they had so much debt, so much leverage on their books, and they had little of their own funds. So that when the value of this, when the value of what they're holding that they use debt to collect, when it drops just by 5%, they're completely wiped out. Does that make sense? So that is what, and that's what the VAR, value at risk model, which has now been discarded, by the way. I think what's now used is, I think, expected shortfall. I think something like that. I've not looked into that yet. But what's my takeaway from all of this? My takeaway from all of this is the model we use in our personal lives. Because we all live, whether we like it or not, we all live our lives based on a model. Whether we subconsciously do it or we deliberately choose to use a live their lives by a model. Um, the lives that we live personally, using a model. that is faulty, or using a model that gives false positives, that gives you false reasons to be comfortable, is full is foolish in the end. But then again, models are exactly that. They are tools. They're like the seatbelt. You know, they can save you from flying out of a car when there's a crash. But also, it doesn't mean that they can save you from being injured when there's a crash. It doesn't mean that you know it, it, it they can't prevent you from being saved or from being um, pulled out of a car wreckage as well. So, but they can save you more on most days. They're a tool that helps safety. So that's example. That's exactly what models are. But at the end of the day, that's the lesson I come away with. And the fact that there were many smart people working in these firms and no one ever questioned that this model was just too it was too convenient. The parameters that the model was using was just too convenient. 15%? Really? Like I'm just I was just I mean, obviously hindsight is 2020 as I say. So looking at it in hindsight, it looks foolish. But then again, that's another thing that happens. Another behavior of human beings, isn't it? Like, if you ain't broke, don't fix it. I'm sure many people thought about it and were like, look, yeah, I'm not quite comfortable with this model we're using. But they're like, shut up. It's making money. It's making us money. So that's what I learned this week. This week I learned that um, value at risk was a model that was used by a lot of the Wall Street um, firms in the run up to the Great Recession. Shout out to the makers of Margin Call. That's one of my favorite movies of all time. Um, Fantastic actor, fantastic cast as well. From Kevin Spacey to, well, Kevin Spacey is not really. Yeah, let's not talk about that. To Demi Moore to Stanley Tucci, um, and the host of others. It was absolutely brilliant. As a matter of fact, it's going to be part of my Christmas entertainment. I'm going to watch it again because I love watching. I love watching the movie because every time I watch it, I see something new. Um, but yeah, so that's what I learned this week. What have you learned? Yeah, have you learned anything new this week? Anyway, peace.